The morning was silent. Only the wind moved through the frozen trees of Belgium. A German Tiger tank tried to start, but the engine coughed and died. The colonel climbed out, his breath turning to mist. Around him, dozens of tanks stood still, and the war felt suddenly quiet. Through the fog, he saw shapes ahead, rows and rows of metal cans, American jerry cans, left behind in haste. 50, 100, 1,000. The colonel stared, realizing what it meant. Fuel, salvation, and a question whispered in his mind. Why would the enemy leave so much behind? As his men refueled, the colonel watched the gauge rise. 50,000 gallons, enough to move an army. But then, a thought chilled him more than the snow. If America could abandon so much, what else could they spare? If you love stories like this, small moments that changed history, remember to like this video. It helps more than you know. He looked at his hands, stained with American gasoline, the smell of victory or the scent of defeat. In that moment, he understood. This war was no longer about courage or tactics, it was about factories and fuel, and somewhere beyond the fog, America's engines were still roaring. It was December 1944, and the forests of the Ardennes were sleeping under a frozen sky. Inside concrete bunkers and muddy tents, German officers whispered of a final chance, a strike that might turn the war. They called it Watch on the Rhine, a name meant to inspire, but it sounded more like a prayer. Hitler's armies were exhausted, their oil tanks nearly dry. Yet still, he demanded movement. Across the border, thousands of men prepared to roll west toward the Meuse River. In the darkness, tank engines coughed to life, the last breath of a dying empire. Snow fell silently over the columns as they began to move, their headlights slicing through the mist. For many, this was not a march of confidence. It was a march of faith. Every wheel that turned was paid for in gasoline Germany no longer had. Colonel Joachim Piper stood beside his Tiger tank, studying a map lit by lantern light. He knew the odds, and still he pressed on. His orders were clear. Reach the river no matter the cost. But as the wind whispered through the trees, he wondered if courage could replace fuel, and if this grand offensive was truly a strategy, or simply denial painted as destiny. In the quiet snow, the fate of an army was sealed before the first shot was fired. The truth was not hidden. It was written in numbers. Each Tiger tank drank 2 gallons of fuel for every mile. The Luftwaffe needed thousands of barrels a day to fly, but had only hundreds left. Germany's synthetic fuel plants, once the pride of its industry, were shattered by bombs. What little fuel remained was stolen from farmers or drained from captured stock. When Piper received his orders, the message was brutal in its honesty. You will reach the Meuse if you capture American fuel. That single line defined the fate of his men. The offensive would live or die by what they could steal. In his war diary, Piper wrote of his frustration. We are fighting with arithmetic, not strength. Engines were shut down during halts to save every drop, and tank crews pushed vehicles by hand down slopes to conserve fuel. Still, he believed in momentum, that shock and speed might do what supply could not. But deep inside, every officer understood the truth. No army can outfight mathematics. And as snow thickened over the forest roads, even the sound of engines began to feel fragile. A heartbeat fading under ice. The forest grew darker, and the dream of victory shrank into silence. At 5:30 on December 16th, the forest exploded with artillery fire. For 2 hours the sky trembled, then fell silent, and the tanks began to move. Colonel Piper led the spearhead, his engines roaring through the frozen valleys. They advanced past villages still asleep, their tracks grinding against stone roads slick with ice. The offensive had begun, but already soldiers were whispering about fuel. Half their reserves were gone before noon. The first American positions fell quickly, but each mile cost more than they could afford. The plan that promised glory had become a contest between hope and the fuel gauge. By nightfall, Piper's men counted distance not in kilometers, but in minutes of engine life. He walked among his vehicles, touching the armor with gloved hands, feeling the vibration fade as engines cooled. It was a strange kind of prayer, a ritual for machines starving in the snow. Ahead lay rumors of an American depot, a sea of fuel waiting in metal cans. The colonel looked toward the horizon, the glow of distant fires lighting the clouds. Somewhere beyond that mist, fate was waiting, and it smelled like gasoline. The Ardennes was not the battlefield the Germans imagined. What looked like highways on the maps were narrow, twisting country lanes. Heavy tanks crushed bridges, trucks skidded into ditches, and entire columns stalled for hours. Engines idled in the cold, burning the very fuel they were meant to save. Piper's men cursed the maps, the snow, and sometimes even the plan itself. They had expected to move swiftly through open ground, but instead they crawled through a frozen maze. In the silence between engines, officers checked compasses under flickering lamps, realizing how far behind schedule they were. American resistance, though scattered, was stubborn. At the small village of Lanzerath, just 18 American soldiers held the road for 10 hours. That single stand burned precious daylight and even more gasoline. Piper, standing beside a dead tank, watched his fuel reserves fall with every passing hour. He understood the new enemy was not the American riflemen, but the distance itself. Still, he pushed forward, knowing retreat was no longer an option. And in the deep forest, the sound of his own engines began to feel like a countdown. By dawn, on December 17th, the column reached Hansfeld. Smoke drifted over the abandoned American camp. Coffee still steamed in metal cups. Fires still burned in oil drums. And there, stacked in long, perfect rows, were the olive-green jerry cans, thousands of them. Piper stopped walking. He stared at the field of fuel, his breath hanging in the cold air. 50,000 gallons, enough to keep his entire division moving for days. The men shouted, laughed, even cheered. It felt like a miracle, like destiny had finally answered their prayers. But as the colonel counted the cans, something dark crept into his thoughts. If America could leave behind this much fuel and not care, what else could they afford to lose? He walked among the rows, his boots crunching on frost, and whispered, "They have oceans. We have drops." In that moment, he understood. Germany's power was measured in courage, America's in capacity, and the world was about to learn which one truly won wars. Beyond the fog, the sound of distant engines grew louder. The American machine was waking, and this was only the beginning. Colonel Piper stood among the American fuel cans, his gloved hands trembling from cold or realization. 50,000 gallons, enough to move his entire column. But behind that number was a darker truth. To America, this was nothing. A single day's waste, a single line on a spreadsheet of abundance. Piper had been raised to believe war was fought by courage. But now, surrounded by the enemy's forgotten fuel, he saw the new battlefield: industry. The war was no longer about soldiers. It was about oil, steel, and the endless rhythm of factories across the ocean. And Germany was already drowning in numbers it could never match. Far away, American refineries roared like sleeping giants. In Texas alone, wells pumped more oil than all of occupied Europe combined. Pipelines stretched across continents like arteries of power. To Piper, these figures were beyond imagination: billions of barrels, millions of tons. In the fog of Belgium, he finally understood what Hitler never would: that courage without supply was only another word for surrender. The war's outcome had already been written, not in blood, but in production reports. In 1944, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, including every captured field and synthetic plant, barely reached 33 million, less than 2%. To American generals, fuel was measured in oceans. To German commanders, it was counted by the can. Every Tiger tank that roared forward consumed the effort of an entire refinery. Every bomber that took flight drank the fuel of villages. The numbers told no lies, and the numbers were merciless. Across France, the Allies had built a miracle of logistics. Pipelines ran under the ocean, pumping gasoline directly from Britain to the front. It was called Operation Pluto. Every day, those unseen veins carried 1 million gallons to the soldiers pushing east. And on land, the Red Ball Express, 6,000 trucks, each burning fuel to deliver more, thundered across Europe non-stop. It was a moving river of gasoline, food, and ammunition. While German soldiers froze beside empty tanks, American drivers sang along the road, their headlights glowing like stars of industry. Piper's men refueled in silence. The captured gasoline hissed into their tanks, mixing German steel with American oil. They laughed for a moment, a fragile happiness, but the colonel said nothing. He had read the captured manifests. The cans came from Texas, then New York, then across the Atlantic, through Liverpool to Normandy, then 400 miles by truck to Hansfeld. 6,000 miles of effort, crossing an entire planet in 6 weeks. The thought crushed him. If his enemy could move oceans that fast, what hope remained for Germany? He stood there as the engines roared again, the smell of foreign fuel filling the cold air. In those fumes, he could almost hear the heartbeat of American industry. Constant, unstoppable, infinite. He realized that Germany had mistaken endurance for power. But power was not bravery. Power was production. And as his column rolled onward, the colonel carried a truth heavier than any weapon: that wars are not won by the strongest soldiers, but by the longest supply lines. Across the Atlantic, the United States had turned its factories into weapons of creation. Oil was only the beginning. Every day, the nation produced planes, ships, and tanks faster than Germany could count them. A new aircraft every 5 minutes, a new ship every day, a tank every 7 minutes. Each number was a blow heavier than any bomb. In Detroit, assembly lines roared day and night, their lights glowing like a sunrise that never ended. Men and women worked side by side, welders, riveters, machinists, each part of a machine larger than war itself. They were not soldiers, yet their hands shaped victory. Germany tried to respond with efficiency, but its factories were crippled by bombings, shortages, and isolation. Synthetic fuel plants were burning ruins. Even Hitler's engineers knew the truth. The Reich had built its war on chemistry, not on capacity. While America built more engines than Germany had dreams, the difference between them grew into a chasm no courage could cross. Colonel Piper would never see those factories, but he was already fighting their shadow. Every American tank he faced was a reminder of that endless production line beyond the ocean. By late December, American pipelines pulsed with life. Fuel moved across France faster than Germany could retreat. Every truck that rolled east carried more than supplies. It carried certainty. Piper's men advanced with captured gasoline, but it was never enough. Every depot they found seemed to whisper the same truth. America had more, much more. The colonel now understood that even victory on the battlefield would change nothing. The real war, the war of industry, was already lost. He wrote in his diary that night, his handwriting shaking from cold. America's strength is not her soldiers, it is her endless flow of fuel. He looked toward the west, where the glow of distant fires painted the sky, and wondered if his nation would ever recover from this imbalance. The trucks behind him rumbled quietly, each engine running on stolen hope. Beyond the hills, more American supply lines stretched like veins across Europe, glowing in the dark. And in that hum of motion, Piper heard the future, the sound of an empire sustained by oil. The numbers had become destiny, and destiny was American. December's morning light was gray and thin, seeping through the twisted branches of the Ardennes. Colonel Piper's tanks rolled forward, engines growling through the frozen fog. Each mile was earned with exhaustion. The forest closed around them like a living thing, narrow roads, steep valleys, and the constant hum of machinery struggling against the cold. For the soldiers inside their armored beasts, the world was reduced to vibration, breath, and the faint smell of fuel. They were deep in enemy territory, but their eyes saw only white frost and dark trees. Somewhere ahead, they believed, waited the Meuse River, and the promise of victory. But victory, like the forest mist, was slipping through their fingers. As night approached, Piper ordered a halt. Engines were cut to save fuel, and the silence that followed was haunting. Men whispered by the tracks, their words lost in the wind. One of them said, "We've come too far to turn back." Piper said nothing. He simply stared into the trees, as if the forest itself was listening. The snow fell harder, covering everything, even their doubts. The column moved again before dawn, engines rumbling like distant thunder. Snow and mud swallowed the wheels, but the tanks pushed forward, following broken maps and fading hope. In the village of Lanzerath, resistance appeared, just 18 Americans dug in and waiting. 18 men who stopped the mightiest German armored column for 10 long hours. Their rifles cracked through the fog, echoing like ghosts. Piper's tanks blasted through at last, but not without cost. They had lost time, fuel, and patience. The soldiers, once filled with confidence, now watched the fuel gauges more than the horizon. When they reached Hansfeld, the silence felt wrong. The town was empty, its flags torn, its roads abandoned. Piper dismounted and walked through the snow-covered streets. And then he saw them. Rows upon rows of olive-green cans glinting through the mist. Fuel, more than he had ever seen in one place. The men cheered as they opened the first can, breathing in the scent of gasoline like salvation. But Piper felt something else, a whisper of unease, as if fate had left him a gift with a hidden price. The men worked quickly, refueling tanks and loading supplies. For a few brief hours it felt like victory. Engines came alive, exhaust smoke rising like ghosts in the morning air. But as Piper counted the cans, the numbers formed a new kind of fear. 50,000 gallons, enough to move his entire force. Yet in his mind, he could not forget the documents he found in the depot. Shipment logs from Texas, New York, Liverpool, Normandy. Fuel that had traveled 6,000 miles in 6 weeks. A supply chain so vast it made his conquest feel meaningless. As he stood among the humming tanks, Piper finally understood the shape of this war. The Americans did not fight with desperation. They fought with abundance. Every bullet, every shell, every drop of gasoline was just another ripple in an endless sea. His men could drink from that sea for 1 day, maybe 2, but the tide was already turning against them. He looked at his hands, stained with American fuel, and whispered, "They have oceans. We have drops." And somewhere in the distance, the sound of Allied engines grew louder, the forest answering his words. The men celebrated their find, laughing as engines thundered again. For a moment, it felt like the war could still be won. They drank hot coffee, smoked in the cold air, and believed that fate had chosen them. 50,000 gallons of fuel, a treasure beyond measure. But Colonel Piper stood apart, watching the liquid gold flow into his tanks. He could not shake the thought that something was wrong. The Americans had fled too easily. They had left behind too much. And as he watched the gauges climb, he realized the cruel truth. What to them was a miracle was to the Americans a rounding error. The difference between desperation and excess. Later that night, Piper opened a captured newspaper. It spoke of a new Allied fuel pipeline, one that could deliver 300,000 gallons every single day. He folded the paper slowly, his breath fogging in the lantern light. That single pipeline produced more than his division could ever steal. He whispered to himself, "We can win battles, but not the math." And outside, the snow continued to fall, burying their false hope under layers of silence. The next morning, the men moved out again, their engines alive with stolen American fuel. They passed frozen villages, the smell of gasoline heavy in the air. But for every mile they advanced, the cost grew clearer. Each drop they burned was another step toward emptiness. Piper knew the truth. They had not captured salvation, only a delay. The Americans had so much, they could afford to leave oceans behind, and Germany was chasing puddles. He climbed onto his tank and looked back at the long column winding through the forest. His men waved, shouting that they were ready. Piper nodded softly and smiled, but in his eyes there was something broken, the look of a man who had seen the future and found no victory there. He spoke quietly to his adjutant. If they can leave this much behind, then they have already won. The wind carried his words away into the trees. If you want to hear how that realization spread across the German army, and what happened when the Americans started burning their own fuel to keep it from capture, make sure to subscribe. The next chapter reveals what came after Hansfeld. By the evening of December 17th, Piper's column pushed deeper into Belgium. The road ahead shimmered with strange light. At first, they thought it was the reflection of dawn, but it was fire. A massive blaze on the horizon. The smell of gasoline drifted through the cold air, thick and sharp. Piper climbed onto his tank and watched as the orange glow swallowed the night sky. His adjutant whispered, "An American depot, sir." The colonel's heart lifted for a moment. Perhaps more fuel, more salvation. But then the truth came from the scouts. The Americans had set their own fuel ablaze. Millions of gallons, burning simply so Germany could not take them. The sky flickered like a storm. Columns of black smoke rose into the clouds, blotting out the moon. It was a sight both terrible and magnificent, the enemy destroying what Piper's men would die to possess. He stood in silence as embers fell through the cold wind. This was more than strategy. It was power on display. And in that moment, he knew that Germany's war was no longer fought against armies, but against capacity itself. When they reached the town of Stavelot, the inferno was still raging. American engineers had poured gasoline across the snow and set it ablaze. The flames towered above the rooftops, reflecting in the eyes of both armies. Piper's tanks arrived too late. The depot was gone, consumed by its own abundance. 2 million gallons sacrificed to deny the enemy. His men stared in disbelief, unable to comprehend such waste. One whispered, "They burn more than we could ever capture." Piper said nothing. He just watched as another explosion turned the night into day. The heat reached them even from miles away. The snow melted under their boots. The air stung with smoke. Officers tried to estimate how much had been lost, but the numbers no longer mattered. What was burned here could have fueled the entire offensive, twice. The colonel turned to his driver and murmured, "They burn victory itself." The driver looked away, ashamed to understand. Above them, sparks rose into the dark sky like ghosts, the souls of a dying dream. For 3 days, the fire burned. The smoke rose so high that pilots could see it from 50 miles away. Villagers said it blotted out the sun. For Piper's men, it was a constant reminder, a beacon of both fury and futility. They advanced through ash-covered roads, their tanks streaked with soot. The snow had turned black. The smell of burning fuel clung to everything, uniforms, helmets, even skin. Men coughed through scarves and tried not to think of what that fuel could have meant. Each night, they slept to the sound of crackling flames echoing through the valleys. One officer wrote in his diary, "They have so much, they destroy what we dream of." the words spread quietly among the troops. It was no longer anger, it was awe. The Americans had shown that victory meant choice, even the choice to burn millions of gallons rather than share defeat. As Piper's convoy rolled on through the glowing haze, the colonel whispered, "The fire ahead is the light of our end." And in the distance, the black sky bled orange once more. By December 18th, the snow had turned to ash. Everywhere Piper's men marched, the world looked burned. Their tanks were gray with soot, their uniforms stained with smoke. The fire at Stavelot still glowed on the horizon, a wound that refused to close. Officers tried to hide their despair, but the silence spoke for them. They no longer looked for victory, only for fuel. Piper watched his soldiers dig into the snow for warmth, their faces hollow, their hope colder than the air itself. Each man knew the truth, but none dared to say it aloud. They were fighting a nation that could afford to burn its own strength. As night fell, the forest shimmered faintly with embers drifting through the fog. Somewhere in the distance, another explosion cracked the air. Piper looked up and whispered, "That is not battle. That is abundance." His adjutant nodded silently. The fires ahead were not just physical, they were symbols of imbalance. For every gallon the Germans fought to preserve, the Americans could destroy 1,000. And yet Piper kept moving forward, not out of belief, but because there was no other direction left to go. By morning, reports came in from across the Ardennes. The Americans were burning everything: fuel, trucks, even supply depots the size of towns. Over 8 million gallons lost in a single week. To Germany, such a number was unimaginable. But to the Allies, it was simply the cost of keeping their advantage. Piper listened to the reports, his gloved hand trembling slightly on the map. 8 million, he murmured, as if the number itself was a weapon. The fire they saw from Stavelot had not been a tragedy. It had been a message, a demonstration that America's power was beyond comprehension. He turned toward his men and gave the order to advance. The tanks rumbled to life once more, engines echoing through the valleys. The air still smelled of smoke and fuel. They were chasing ghosts now, burning shadows that left only ruin in their wake. Piper knew they could not win, yet he moved forward out of duty. Behind him, the flames of the Ardennes still painted the horizon. Ahead, the forest grew darker, and the sound of American engines was drawing closer. The battle was changing shape, and in the next chapter, it would no longer be about fire, but about the machines that never stopped coming. As Piper's tanks crawled through the blackened forest, far away across the ocean, another army was at work. An army of machines. In Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh, the hum of industry never stopped. Factory doors never closed, lights never went dark. Conveyor belts poured out trucks, jeeps, and aircraft with mechanical precision. It was not a battle fought with bullets, but with bolts. Every screw turned in an American factory was another heartbeat in a war that Germany could no longer understand. Men and women labored under sparks and smoke, their hands black with oil, yet their rhythm was unstoppable. To Piper, trudging through frozen mud, this unseen enemy was the most terrifying of all. He had faced Russian winters and American guns, but not this. an opponent who could replace every loss overnight. For every Tiger tank he lost, America built 100 Shermans. For every plane shot down, another took flight before sunset. In the quiet moments between orders, he thought about that endless sound, the hum of production echoing across an ocean, a sound that would decide the fate of empires. The numbers told a story more brutal than any battle. In 1944, America produced more than 320,000 aircraft, while Germany built barely one-third of that. For every German tank, America made 2. For every ship Germany launched, the United States launched 10. Entire cities in America were built around production, places where metal sang, where machines gave birth to machines. Steel mills roared, refineries burned bright through the night, and the railroads carried endless rivers of parts to the coast. Each train that left Pittsburgh or Detroit carried more strength than a division of soldiers. Even the workers felt it. They read the reports. They knew the weight of their labor. A riveter in Michigan could point at the newspaper and say, "That's my plane in France." And she'd be right. The war had stretched its arms across the Atlantic, linking the hum of a factory to the roar of a battlefield. For Piper, the realization was crushing. He fought in mud and blood, while his enemy fought with electricity and oil. The age of the soldier was ending, and the age of the machine had begun. By the time Piper's tanks reached the next village, the engines were running on fumes again. The captured fuel from Hansfeld was nearly gone. Men siphoned the last drops from broken trucks, trying to feed machines that refused to rest. They were surrounded by silence, except for the faint thrum of engines echoing from the west. American convoys, thousands of vehicles moving in rhythm, their sound like thunder rolling through the valleys. To Piper, it was the voice of an empire that never slept. Every hour of movement meant another mile of defeat. He realized then that Germany's strength had never been in its machines. It had been in its will. But willpower could not make steel, nor could pride refine oil. The Americans were not fighting harder. They were simply fighting longer. And that was enough. As Piper looked at the smoke rising from his last tank, he whispered to no one, "We are out of fuel, but they are out of nothing." Then he turned toward the horizon, where distant engines still roared, and marched into the sound. Across Europe, American supply lines had become living rivers of motion. Thousands of trucks stretched across the continent, headlights glowing through mist and rain. Each one carried fuel, ammunition, or food, and each one burned gasoline faster than Germany could dream of producing it. The Red Ball Express never slept. Day and night, soldiers drove through mud and fire, guided only by colored signs and faith in the machine. They joked that they could follow the smell of gasoline to the front line. To Piper's soldiers, still scavenging for every drop, it felt like another world. At dawn, his men watched a captured film reel showing American convoys crossing France. Rows upon rows of vehicles, all moving with perfect coordination. No shouting, no chaos, only rhythm. It was war as choreography. One German mechanic whispered, "They fight with motion. We fight with memory." Piper didn't respond. He only stared at the screen, realizing that this, not courage, not strategy, was the real weapon of the Allies. The endless convoy. the hum that never stopped. By Christmas week, Piper's tanks stood silent, engines dead, treads frozen in place. Around them, the forest echoed with the distant rumble of American machinery, tanks, trucks, and planes. The sound was endless. It was the sound of replacement, of power that could not be exhausted. Piper understood that Germany had entered a war of endurance, and lost before it began. No tactic, no bravery could fight against a factory that never slept. He touched the cold metal of his tank and whispered softly, "You were built for glory, but they were built forever." The sun rose behind a haze of smoke and frost. In the distance, Allied bombers flew overhead, their engines humming like an industrial hymn. Piper turned away, his breath fading into the cold air. He had seen the future, a world where machines ruled battlefields and production lines decided destiny. What do you think it must have felt like to fight not against men, but against industry itself? Leave a comment below, and join us in the next chapter, where the very skies above Germany would become engines of fate. While Piper's men searched the Belgian countryside for barrels of fuel, beneath the English Channel a secret flowed. Pipelines, stretching like veins under the sea, pumped life straight into the Allied war machine. It was called Operation Pluto. Hundreds of miles of steel pipe laid across the ocean floor, carrying gasoline from Britain to France. Each day, 1 million gallons flowed unseen, silent and unstoppable. It was engineering turned into strategy, technology transformed into victory. And for Germany, it was invisible death. Fuel lines they could never reach, never destroy, never even see. American and British engineers worked through storms and bombs, keeping the flow alive. Ships refilled the lines daily, pumping power into Europe faster than armies could consume it. While German tanks stalled for lack of oil, Allied vehicles were drowning in abundance. The numbers grew absurd. 1 million gallons one day, 2 million the next. The ocean itself had become an ally. In the Ardennes, Piper's men froze in silence, unaware that under the waves their defeat was already in motion. Everywhere the Allies went, fuel followed. From Normandy to the Ardennes, every mile of road carried tankers, convoys, and pipelines feeding the front. They called it the lifeblood of liberation, and it never stopped. American logisticians built systems so vast that no single failure could slow them. If one route was bombed, another opened within hours. If a depot was lost, a new one appeared overnight. It was a network of motion, a living creature made of fuel and metal. Every truck, every pump, every driver was part of it. Piper had once believed that warfare was chaos, unpredictable and personal. But watching his enemies move with mechanical precision, he saw something different. The Allies were not improvising. They were manufacturing victory. Their supply lines didn't depend on luck or courage. They depended on production schedules, and the result was unstoppable. Even as winter choked the roads and frost sealed engines, American fuel arrived. Always on time, always enough. To Piper's exhausted men, it felt like fighting an empire that could not run out of breath. As Piper's column struggled for every drop, American units began destroying fuel to save time. At first, it seemed insane. Soldiers pouring gasoline onto the snow, setting it ablaze to avoid transport delays. But soon it became clear they could afford it. They had more fuel than space to store it. Tankers arrived faster than the front could move. In Belgium, fields burned with excess gasoline, not from shortage, but from overflow. The sight of it broke German morale more than any weapon. To fight an enemy who wasted abundance was to fight inevitability itself. Reports from prisoners spoke of disbelief. One captured officer said, "We watched them burn what we would die for." That sentence spread like smoke through the ranks. Even the most loyal soldiers began to doubt. They saw American trucks idling for hours just to keep their crews warm. Something unthinkable in the Reich. And Piper, watching from the forest, realized that this was the real difference between nations. Germany measured war in liters. America measured it in oceans. For the Americans, fuel was not treasure. It was routine. Every day, pipelines pulsed, convoys rolled, and tankers unloaded across the ports of Europe. Gasoline flowed like blood through the veins of an empire that understood movement better than any army before it. In France, entire rail networks were redesigned only to feed the flow of petroleum eastward. What had begun as logistics had become a kind of art, the art of endless motion. For every gallon burned, 2 more were already on their way. To Piper's exhausted men, the contrast felt surreal. They fought for survival. Their enemy fought with supply. By late December, the difference was absolute. The Americans could move divisions across continents without delay, while German tanks stood silent in the snow. Piper's adjutant once said, "They move like rivers. We freeze like lakes." He was right. Every passing hour revealed how outmatched Germany had become. Even the sky seemed to belong to the Allies, planes circling endlessly, fueled by invisible abundance. Piper no longer asked when the fuel would come. He knew it never would. The forest had gone quiet again. Piper's engines were dead, his men scattered across the frozen ground. In the distance, the thunder of American convoys rolled like a constant drumbeat. It was no longer battle. It was rhythm. Fuel trucks roared by in endless chains, their lights flickering through the mist. To Piper, it sounded like time itself, something that moved forward, never backward. He realized that Germany had not lost because of courage or tactics, but because the world had changed. The nation with the longest supply line had become the new superpower. He stood beside his tank, frost clinging to the metal, and whispered, "They will never stop moving." And he was right. America's engines were already crossing oceans, building bases, fueling the next century. The age of the machine had only begun. If you found this story powerful and want others to feel what war's transformation truly meant, share this story and join us in the next chapter, where the endless supply meets the endless sky. Above the snow and the smoke, another war was being fought. While tanks crawled through mud and soldiers froze in the Ardennes, the skies thundered with engines. Thousands of American bombers crossed the clouds every day, silver shadows carrying destruction and destiny. Each plane was powered by the same machine that fed the ground war: oil, production, and relentless rhythm. From the ground, Piper's men could hear them before they saw them, the steady hum that sounded like an approaching storm. To the Americans, it was progress. To the Germans, it was prophecy. Every factory in Germany had become a target. Synthetic fuel plants, refineries, rail yards, all marked for destruction. The bombers came in waves so thick they darkened the sky. Even when anti-aircraft guns roared, the clouds seemed endless with engines. Piper once looked up and said quietly, "They fly like they have the sky itself on their side." And, in a way, they did. Each passing formation was a symbol of numbers, of endurance, of a world powered by the air itself. By 1944, the air over Germany had turned into a conveyor belt of fire. Day and night, American and British bombers filled the sky, not randomly, but with mechanical precision. It was not rage, it was procedure. Each target was calculated, each bomb logged and measured. The destruction came not from chaos, but from order. Fuel refineries vanished, bridges collapsed, and the factories that once built tanks were reduced to dust. Every blast was another calculation fulfilled. The war had become mathematics in motion. On the ground, civilians and soldiers alike watched in awe and terror. The sky glowed orange for hours after the raids. Engines never stopped, even in winter storms. Piper's division marched under falling ash, the air thick with smoke and snow. He no longer saw the bombers as weapons, but as proof that humanity had built something larger than itself. The noise above was not just destruction. It was industry turned divine. And for Germany, it was the sound of inevitability. At night, the bombers did not stop. Their engines hummed across the dark horizon like a lullaby of steel. Searchlights swept the clouds, tracing white beams through the smoke. Anti-aircraft guns thundered in vain, while civilians hid beneath trembling walls. The sky had become an assembly line, producing fire instead of machines. Each raid was part of a schedule, as precise as any clock. Germany had once dreamed of total war, but America had built it. Piper and his men marched under that constant sound, the low vibration that shook the ground even miles away. They could not fight what they could not reach. The sky itself had become a factory, building the end of their world. For the first time, Piper felt small, not as a soldier, but as a man standing beneath something endless. He whispered, "They don't just own the land, they own the air." Above him, the clouds glowed faint orange, the reflection of another burning city far away. And through it all, the engines never stopped. By late 1944, the bombers owned the daylight. They came every morning, hundreds, then thousands, until the sky looked like a moving ceiling of steel. Factories, railroads, and cities all blurred together beneath the falling shadows. Even the sun seemed dimmer, veiled by the smoke of war. German children learned to tell time by the sound of the sirens. To Piper, marching below those dark clouds, it felt like living under a machine that had swallowed the heavens. Every day began and ended with the hum of engines, an endless sky that refused to rest. The American air fleets didn't chase glory. They chased efficiency. Each mission followed the logic of industry. Bombers replaced emotion with precision. Their wings carried mathematics. They flew so high that soldiers on the ground could only see glints of silver cutting through the blue. And when the bombs fell, they didn't fall like weapons. They fell like products from an invisible factory in the clouds. The war had become a cycle. Build, fly, destroy, repeat, and in that rhythm, Germany was slowly erased. By January 1945, the sound of engines filled every horizon. Even when no bombers were visible, their echo lived in the air, a hum that never left. Peiper knew the war was over before his superiors did. He saw it not in battles, but in the sky itself. The same skies that once brought dreams of conquest now carried only American wings. It was no longer a contest of men, but of momentum. And momentum belonged to those who could build without stopping. He stood beneath a pale sunrise, watching contrails stretch across the sky like white scars. Each one marked another chapter closing. He whispered, "They have taken the air, and with it, the future." Behind him, his men packed their last supplies, engines cold and silent. The sound of distant planes rolled over the horizon once more, steady as a heartbeat. If you've been following this journey through fire, machines, and the minds of those who fought beneath them, subscribe and join us in the next chapter, where the war's end would come not from surrender, but from exhaustion. The war did not end with an explosion. It ended with silence. After months of thunder, the skies above Europe grew still. No bombers, no convoys, no distant hum of engines. Only the wind, whispering through broken trees and empty towns. For the first time, Peiper could hear his own footsteps echoing through the snow. He looked to the horizon, where once there had been fire, and now there was only smoke fading into the clouds. The noise that had once filled the world had vanished, leaving behind a strange kind of peace. But it was not victory. It was absence. He stood beside his burned tank, the metal cold and lifeless. Its tracks were frozen into the ground, pointing nowhere. All around him lay the remains of machines that had once promised glory. Engines, now quiet, covered in frost. He knelt and pressed his gloved hand to the armor. It felt like touching a grave. The world had changed sound, from the roar of power to the stillness of consequence. And in that stillness, Peiper finally understood that silence was not peace. It was the echo of exhaustion. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet deepened. Villages that once shook under bomb blasts now stood untouched by sound. The people emerged slowly, blinking at the daylight. They looked up expecting planes, but saw only clouds. For the first time in years, the sky belonged to no one. Peiper's men wandered among the wreckage, gathering whatever warmth they could find. They moved like ghosts, shadows of a defeated army still bound by orders that no longer mattered. The world had kept moving, but without them. In distant cities, factories began to slow. The machines that had once defined life were shutting down one by one. The silence of victory was spreading, but it was not gentle. It was heavy, filled with what could never be rebuilt. Peiper watched an old factory smoldering in the distance, its smoke curling toward the empty sky. He thought of how many lives had turned its gears, how much oil had fed its fires. Now there was nothing left to burn, only memory. And memory, he realized, was the heaviest fuel of all. The war that had once filled the heavens was gone. No contrails, no searchlights, no roaring engines tearing through the clouds. The sky had become blue again, fragile, endless, human. Peiper sat alone by the ruins of a farmhouse, watching a flock of birds rise over the hills. For a moment, he closed his eyes and could almost believe it was before the war. But even peace had its sound. The quiet ticking of clocks, the whisper of wind through broken glass, the heartbeat of those left behind. It was not the sound of victory. It was the sound of survival. The world would rebuild, but not as it was. The men who had lived through the storm had changed forever. Factories would reopen, nations would heal, but the memory of the engines would remain. Every hum, every vibration in the years to come would remind them of what power could create and destroy. As Piper stood to leave, he looked once more at the calm horizon and said softly, "The sky is free again, but it remembers." And above him, clouds drifted quietly, unarmed at last. Spring came slowly to the ruins. The snow melted into rivers that ran between burned fields and broken bridges. Children played where tanks once stood, their laughter echoing through the empty streets. But even in this fragile peace, the scars of machinery remained. Rusting engines dotted the landscape like monuments to a forgotten faith. Each one told the same story, that power had limits, and those who chased it too far were always left behind. Piper walked through the fields, the air filled with birds instead of planes. Yet every wing beat reminded him of propellers that once filled the sky. The towns rebuilt themselves, brick by brick, but the people rebuilt differently. They no longer trusted the noise of progress. Factories reopened with caution, and the new machines hummed more softly. Piper passed a group of workers repairing a bridge and heard one man say, "We build now, not to conquer, but to continue." The words stayed with him. For the first time, he felt that maybe history itself had grown tired of fighting. Years later, Piper returned to the same road where his engines had once thundered. The forest had grown back, swallowing the traces of war. Where fuel depots once burned, wildflowers now swayed in the wind. He stood in silence, listening. But there was nothing to hear. Only the rustle of leaves, the breath of the earth reclaiming what machines had taken. He realized that the war's true ending was not a treaty, but this, the return of quiet. The silence that had once haunted him now felt like absolution. As he turned to leave, he looked back one last time. The sun was setting through the trees, casting long orange lines across the snow. He whispered, "They had the machines, but we had the memory." Then he smiled faintly, knowing that in the end, memory outlived metal. If this story made you feel the weight of history, the silence after the noise, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and join us in the final chapter, where history looks back, not in victory or defeat, but in reflection on what war truly leaves behind. Years after the war, the roads of Europe were still scarred. Deep ruts carved by tank treads had filled with rainwater, reflecting the clouds above. Children walked those paths unaware that the earth beneath their feet had once shaken with engines. Each stone, each bridge, each field held a memory. Sometimes travelers said they could still hear faint echoes, not of war, but of motion, the rhythm of men and machines moving toward their fate. And in that rhythm, the continent had learned something ancient, that movement without purpose only leads to silence. Piper's story faded into history, but the roads remained. Convoys still passed, now filled with food, medicine, and rebuilding tools. Trucks replaced tanks, and the same engines that once carried destruction now carried renewal. Europe was breathing again, slowly, carefully. And though no one said his name anymore, Piper's footprints were part of the dust those trucks raised. The earth had kept his memory, even when people had not. Factories that once made weapons now built washing machines and tractors. The same hands that forged steel for war now shaped it for peace. But the hum was the same. The heartbeat of industry never truly stopped. It simply changed its purpose. And yet, every vibration carried a question. Could humanity create without destroying? Could the same rhythm that built bombs build a better world? The answers were slow, fragile, and uncertain. But they were there, in every rebuilt bridge, every new generation born under a quieter sky. Piper's War was only one chapter in a much larger book, the story of machines and men learning to coexist. The machines had not been evil, only obedient. They had followed the will of those who built them. Now, as the world rebuilt, people began to see the reflection of their choices in the hum of the new age. The echo of iron had not vanished. It had simply changed tone. Decades later, the tanks stood behind glass, their metal shells polished, their engines silent. Tourists walked past, reading placards and listening to audio guides that tried to capture the noise of a war long gone. But the recordings could never match reality. The true sound of that age lived only in memory. The roar of engines, the whistle of bombs, the distant hum of an empire that never slept. And in that museum silence, some visitors said they felt a strange calm, the peace of knowing that the noise had finally stopped. A child looked up at one of the tanks and asked, "Did it win?" His father smiled softly and said, "No one did." The machines had outlived their purpose, but not their lesson. They stood as reminders that power, once unleashed, cannot be forgotten, only remembered. The air in the museum was still, yet heavy, like the pause between one breath and the next. Outside the museum, the world was alive again. Engines hummed in the streets, but softly. Cars, buses, planes, all born from the same ancestors of war. The difference was choice. People now built not because they had to, but because they could. The machines that once divided mankind now connected it. But the echo of iron never truly vanished. It lived in every vibration of progress, reminding the world of what it once cost. And maybe that was enough, to remember and to continue. As the sun set, its reflection glinted off the museum glass, turning it gold. Piper's story had ended long ago, but the hum he once feared had become something gentler, the rhythm of life itself. If you've journeyed this far, through fire, steel, and silence, subscribe and stay with us for what comes next. Because history never really ends. It only waits for someone to listen again.